Hello, students. In this segment of our Neurons on Fire series, we're going to look at the study skill of organizing. So up to this point, you've probably already read and taken in information about collecting. And you collect information, you capture information from your readings, whether it's your textbook readings or readings of different kinds of articles or websites. And you've also collected information that you have taken notes from, whether again, it's the reading or it's lecture or discussion in class. And so now we need to take that information that you've collected and we need to organize it in ways that are meaningful to you. So our whole goal in talking about the study skill of organization means you're creating a lot of different kinds of effective study materials. It's not good enough to just keep reading over the same notes that you took from the reading or the lecture. You need to organize it in a way that makes sense to you. At this point, you may be asking yourself, why exactly do I need to organize my notes, whether they're from the reading or from the lecture discussion? Why do I need to organize those into study materials? Why can't I just study directly from the notes that I've taken? And the answer is here on this slide. So what you see in front of you, it's a beautiful view, right? It explains the difference between something called surface learning versus something called deep learning. So imagine you are at this beautiful location and I tell you, I want you to tell me what you know about the ocean, what you're going to know about the ocean, what you learn about the ocean. But in one case, you're going to practice skimming the surface. And in another, you're going to practice deep diving into the water. Okay, so when you skim the surface, you take your little net, right, and you just get those upper 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters off the surface of the ocean. And from that sample, you're going to tell me all about the ocean. Doesn't work that way, right? In order to truly understand the ocean, not only do you need that surface, right? You need to explore all the way down through the depths to the deepest location, which is actually a place called the Marianas Trench, which goes down almost the equivalent of a Mount Everest, but down instead of up. So you would need to explore all the nooks and crannies of this ocean, and that's how you would really have an understanding of what the ocean is. Now, the same thing is true in learning. We can practice surface learning, which is just kind of skimming the surface, and we do this when we just kind of graze over our notes. We flip through the notes that we've taken about the textbook or flip through the notes that we've taken in class, and we kind of have it in our short-term memory, and we can go in the next day and we can take a test, and we actually can get an A on the test the next day, practicing this very skimming the surface, getting the basics and reciting it back. But that's not what we want to do, because our objective in college and in life is so much bigger. We want to learn because it's grounding us. It's explaining things that are going to help with future learning. Making decisions in the world, whether they're decisions for ourselves, our families, our communities, whether it's economic decisions or political decisions or social decisions. So everything that we learn and that we take in, it helps us understand, apply, and solve new problems and be a creative and critical thinker. But we can't really do that if we don't really have the information down deep. And deep learning takes time and it takes effort. So when we study the way that we're getting ready to talk about with this particular PowerPoint, when we talk about organizing your study materials, that's really putting into an effect, putting into operation the deep learning process. So you're going to be extracting information from the notes that you've taken from your reading materials. You're going to extract information that you have taken from your lectures and your discussions, and you're going to put it in a manner that makes sense to you, that is ingrained in your neurons. That's a pathway that you've explored quite a bit. So we want to be practicing deep learning when we study. There are essentially three principles that help us practice this deep and long-lasting learning. The first one is having prior learning, and that means that you take any new information that's coming in, you're learning something new, and you relate it to what you already know. It's kind of like there's a grounding, there's a context, so anything new that you learn, you adhere it to that old information, and that leads to growth of your brain and of your neural net. The second way that we develop deep learning is that we have some kind of quality of processing. And the idea here is that we want to use as many different kinds of strategies as we can. Now, we're going to talk about this again later, but the idea is the more pathways that we have into the brain, the more different pathways that we have in the brain, the more likely it is that we are going to remember something. So the more different strategies and connections that we make, whether it's through visual, auditory, tactile, even sensory inputs such as smell and taste, the more different pathways, the more different strategies, the more different ways that we can contextualize an experience, the more likely we are to remember it. And that's the one we're focusing on here in this particular discussion with organizing your study materials. We're going to focus on quality of processing. And the last one is quantity of processing. You know, this is another principle that leads to deep learning. And the idea here is that practice, practice, practice. We need to have frequent practice sessions of a sufficient length. You know, they don't have to be hugely long, but they have to be of significant length. And we need to distribute it over time. That's what leads to the greatest learning. So these one-time shots that we were talking earlier about surface learning, where you just cram the night before by flipping through your notebook, that's not going to result in deep learning. So let's focus on that quality of processing for this discussion. Just like we talked about when we looked at reading strategies and note-taking strategies, there are 3 different time periods by which you can work on organizing your study materials. It's not just the process of organizing the study materials, it's what happens before and after as well. So in your textbook, as always, they share strategies that you can use before, during, and after. Please read those over and try them. Mark up your textbook. Maybe you already do some. Maybe some are too far-fetched, but maybe some are in that sweet spot of something just a little out of your comfort zone, something that you're not doing that you might try to do. Right now, what I'd like to talk about are a couple of the strategies that I use during these 3 time periods. So for the before one of the things that I'm a big proponent on, partially why I love interior design, but we've probably already talked about that in this course, that's one of my passions, is that I think it's really important to create an ideal study space. And if you remember earlier in the semester when we talked about learning styles, we also talked about study environment. So it's really important to have a conducive place to study, and I think it's really important to make it a space that you feel is homey for studying, that it feels like you're energized and you want to get to work studying. You enjoy the area, the environment. So you need to create that sense of study place, right? And another thing is you might actually want to have a couple of these beautiful, I don't want to say beautiful, in my mind it's beautiful, and these beautiful study spaces, and by beautiful I mean the zone that works for you. And you might want to have a couple of them. You know, maybe there's one place at school that you really like to study, you can create that environment works for you. And then maybe there's another one at home, and maybe another one at a relative's home or something like that, because the variety of the spaces also does help us with deep processing. The second thing that I do a lot is I arrange to be undisturbed, okay? If you let it, people, things, and events will distract you from your learning. And every time it does, it takes us away from being involved and engaged in deep learning. So if you need to put a please do not disturb sign on the door, you need to establish a habit with your family and friends that you're not disturbed at this particular time when you're studying. Turn off your cell phone, put it in another room, put it on vibrate. You don't have the phone anywhere near you, kind of thing. And I really like how the textbook says it. They say, protect the sanctity of your study time. You've got to make studying a priority and eliminating those distractions. Another thing the textbook says that I absolutely think is fantastic in terms of questioning yourself, they say one way to decide is to ask yourself, would a basketball coach or any kind of a coach allow their players to do this or that during practice? And the answer is no, because it's a distraction. So if a coach wouldn't let them do it because they're taking their mind off the game, why would you be taking your mind off the studying game? And the other thing that I do in the before strategy is that I actually do create a distributed study schedule. So if you know, like you have a test and there's going to be another test in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you start divvying up, right? You know, when you're going to be practicing your notes, studying your notes, reviewing things, when you're going to be studying the notes that you've taken from the lecture and so forth, the ones that you've condensed and polished, of course. But if you set up the schedule and you stick to it, you're not going to have that cramming thing that
that happens at the very end, just to, shove the information into your brain as short of time period as possible. Now in the during section, right, there's a lot of different things that you can do, but two of the things that I do is I create test questions. And my husband, even, he's also a professor at STC, and he actually has his students develop test questions in class, and then they exchange them and they answer them, and then they exchange again. So he has his students actually make up test questions, and this becomes part of the test bank. But the idea is that students are thinking and working actively with the material. And another thing that I like to do is to create flashcards. Flashcards are awesome because they're visual tools. They're also tactile because you can, if you're a tactile learner, you can be shuffling between the cards. But on one side, you put one piece of information. On the other side, you put the answer, and it can be about a variety of things. It can be a word and its definition. It can be somebody that you learned from a historical nature and what they did. It can be you put a math problem on one side and the solution on the other, and so forth. But flashcards are a really good strategy. They work awesomely. And the last bit of information I want to share is what I do after in terms of organizing my study materials. And sometimes you study and you learn, but you just need a little bit more information or something that kind of puts a story or a context to what you learned. And so it's really helpful to tap into other resources. Whether you look something up in another book or an article or a website, or you Google it, you go to the library and you seek out information from reference librarians and so forth. You go and talk to your professor a little bit. Maybe they have an anecdote or a story about something. Also, YouTubing things, right? I love going to podcasts, I listen to podcasts when I'm at the gym or when I'm taking a walk or things like that. Just the other day, I was listening to a podcast by two graduate students in psychology, and they were talking about Abraham Maslow. And it's just fascinating, just a little bit more information, and your brain's working on that material. You don't necessarily have to memorize and retain all of it, but it kind of contextualizes what you already know. So please, in your textbook, read about all of those different strategies and try some of them out.